Romans 14, Unplugged, Feasts and Fasts and Food, oh my. We already looked at the introduction, scope, and style of this particular study last week. Go back and listen to last week's podcast or watch episode 80's YouTube video. Give me a second. Let me just look at my time, see what we're doing. Oh my, I'm running out of time already. Okay. All right, let's keep going for about 10 or 15 more minutes. I may eat up some of my segment 2 time to finish segment 1. So we looked at the scope and style of this study and really just the introduction to the study. And originally I was going to jump past verses 1 through 3 and jump right into verse 4 and start 4 and 5 and start talking about our Christians free to worship God any day of the week and hit kind of that main topic that most people are used to studying about, which is those special days that Paul talks about. One man esteems one day, another esteems another day. Each should be fully convinced or on the mind, that type of thing. But instead of doing that, I really felt that it's necessary to go back, start at verse 1, and establish the context of the recipients of the letter. Who are the addressees? And by doing so, that will frame the context of the instructions, and it will actually lend support for my particular viewpoint on the particular verses that we're going to be studying. So in the end, it will be a complete commentary on Romans chapter 14, contrary to what I said earlier, how that I will not have a comprehensive verse-by-verse commentary. I'm going to change that. It is going to be a comprehensive verse-by-verse commentary, so that's just the way it worked out. All right, so verse 1, let's jump right into it. Romans 14, verse 1, who are the weak in faith? Let me do this. I'm going to blow my font up just a little bit so it's easier on my eyes to read. Yeah, I like that. Okay. So, also you can see it easier if you're watching this video. So here we go. Verse 1, the section 1, if you want to call it that, chapter heading, whatever. Who are the weak in faith? That's really the first question we need to ask. I think it's universally understood that the strong, the unnamed strong, until we get to chapter 15, verse 1, the unnamed strong are actually Christians. Whether they be Jewish Christians or Gentile Christians, they're certainly believers. They are strong, and the strength of their faith is equated with faith in Messiah. So there's very little commenting that I need to make on who are the strong. It's the differences of opinion on who are the weak that we get the most contrasting views when we look through various Christian and Messianic commentaries. So let's read verse 1 again real quick out of the ESV and the SBLGNT in my commentary. Verse 1 says, as for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. And the Greek says, ton de estinunte, te piste pras lambaneste, me eis diakrises dialogismon. All right, this first section is going to seem a little bit lengthy. In fact, it's about 10 pages in a word format. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read nonstop a lot of what's written, and then I'll go back and comment on what I wrote. If I have to stop and interject, I'll do so, but I'll try to resist that so that we can simply get a lot of this into the video and onto the recording for that sake, okay? So, and most of it's self-explanatory, so I'll kind of read some of it slow, and I hope you'll be able to follow along. All right, here are the notes. Let's just start right here. Stop doing that. All right, let's go like that. My mouse is not cooperating with me. All right, here we go. These first few verses help to set the context of the entire chapter, since it establishes the identity of the original recipients of the letter. So that we may utilize their identity to frame our interpretation of Paul's instructions, we will spend a bit more time examining the possibilities of exactly who we are dealing with here. Indeed, the weak and the strong are the two primary addressees, and yet the strong are not mentioned by name until we get to chapter 15, like I mentioned earlier. I mean, we know who the strong are by implication, and Paul being one of them. And most of the instructions, to be sure, in chapter 14 are directed towards the strong, because they are the ones who have the greater responsibility of not only properly receiving Paul's instructions, but implementing them with an expected amount of maturity in their faith. I go on to say, some initial yet brief biblical Greek language and grammar observations from the first few verses will be also helpful before we compare differing Christian and Messianic Jewish authors on exactly who were the weak and the strong. Understand what I mean? So what I'm going to do for right now, this is going to seem somewhat laborious to some of you and a bit trivial and maybe even complicated, but it's necessary to supply some of the Greek background behind some of the verses and phrases so that we can begin to investigate and ascertain the identity of who these weak and strong were. All right, let's keep going. Start right there. The Greek word translated weak is rooted in the verb astheneo, meaning to be weak, feeble, to be ill, without strength, or to language. I think the footnote number 1 points to probably Thayer's and Smith's Bible Dictionary, if I'm correct, without clicking on the link right now. The verb is rooted in asthenes, which is an adjective derived from without, and sthenos, vigor and strength. So we can see it's what we call an alpha privative in Greek. So it's the negative version. So it's strength that is without, or without strength, i.e. weak. Properly without vigor, living in a state of weakness or depletion. Aratriao refers to lack of necessity or resources, or insufficient. Literally without adequate strength, and hence frail, feeble, or sickly. And again, we've got a footnote to probably Thayer's and Smith's, or it might be Strong's online Bible concordance that I can consulted there. I go on to say, stop doing that. Here we go. I go on to say, in fact, according to the same online Strong's Concordance that I referenced from BibleHub.com, the verbal form of this word, astheneo, weak, right, the verbal form, is found 33 times in the New Testament, of which the NASB translates into the English as, quote, am weak once, becoming weak once, fell sick once, sick 18 times, and weak 12. So what we can see just from looking at some of the raw data is that this word is used throughout the New Testament typically to describe sickness, like physical illness. The word sick there. All right, let's continue. The Greek of the first clause from the ESV, quote, as for the one who is weak in faith, reads ton de asthenunta te piste, and it could be read literally as, quote, the one now being weak in the faith, end quote. Again, that literal translation is from BibleHub.com. Notice it's the one now being weak in the faith. And this is owing to the fact that the word weak, asthenunta, is a, let me scroll up a little bit. This word is actually a masculine singular verb in the present tense, participle mood, active voice, and accusative case, while the dative case feminine singular noun faith, right, weak in the faith, is preceded by a dative case feminine singular definite article te, i.e. yielding the faith, as opposed to simply faith. I hope I didn't lose anyone there with all the Greek mumbo jumbo. I'm simply trying to show us that there are a few different ways that we could translate this phrase, ton de asthenunta te piste, the one who is being weak in the faith. It's a verb instead of what we would normally think as an adjective, the one who is weak in the faith. We would normally think of weak in the faith, the word weak there. In English, we kind of interact with that as if it were an adjective, but it's not an adjective. It's actually a verb. And it's, as I mentioned, it's a verb in the present tense participle. So it's kind of got this ongoing ing aspect to it, as with all participles. It's presently ongoing. It's a present tense. They are presently, the people, they are presently now being, that's the now part, present tense, being weak, that's the verb, in the te pist, te piste, the faith, as in a recognized specific faith, as opposed to simply saying they're weak in faith. All right. This exact same Greek construction, the one being weak, albeit minus te piste, the in the faith part, and exists in a different case simply because of the differences between Koine Greek subjects and objects, is repeated by Paul in the very next verse where he states, quote, one person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Notice he says the weak person. He doesn't say the weak in the faith person. So we've got the Greek of Romans 14:2 has has men pistue phagein pantaha de astenon lakanta estie. So we have some extra words there, and we have some words that are removed, but we can tell instantly by comparing verses 1 and 2 that the primary phrase ha de astenon is very similar to, in verse 2, is very similar to de asthenunta, right? The one now being weak in the faith is mentioned as the same person, the one who is now weak, the one being weak, the person being weak. So I say in my commentary, we'll comment a bit more on the importance of the Greek constructions a bit later on, but for now, let us ascertain what we can gather about the identity of these quarreling parties, right, the weak and the strong, from researching the various Christian and Jewish perspectives on them. By the way, I personally do not believe it seriously changes the central message of the passage, whether we translate the noun, right, the piste, whether we translate that with or without the article, whether we have in the faith versus in faith. However, at least one well-known Christian author disagrees with me, as we shall shortly see. So some people like to make a big deal out of that. I personally don't make that much of a deal out of it, as far as I can tell. Many translators simply reference it as the faith or the faith. In fact, if it were that big of a deal, why didn't Paul repeat it here in verse 2? 14 verse 2 leaves out the reference to piste altogether. So anyway, let's keep going. I say in my commentary, switching gears from looking at the Greek for now, it is fair to say that there's no secret that many Christian commentators spend quite a bit of time comparing the context of Romans 14 to that of 1 Corinthians 8 and parts of 10. Now, I didn't read either one of those Corinthian passages for my liturgy or anything like that, and we might read them a little later on in the study so that you're familiar with the passages. But just so you know, in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul has this discussion with this readership there about food offered to idols and things like that. And then in chapter 10, he also talks about that same topic about partaking of food that someone offers you, an unbeliever invites you into their home, and you realize that the food's been offered to idol. What should you do? Things like that. That's kind of the context of those particular passages. And there's some verbiage in those Corinthian passages that is mirrored in the Romans 14 passages. So what I say in my notes here is, for our study, I take note that at least one well-known Messianic Jewish website believes that the weak and the strong of Romans 14 are the same weak and strong of 1 Corinthians 8 and 10. Understand what I say there? In other words, internally, if we look at Paul's writings as a whole, then as Bible students, we can begin to draw some similarities between the two books, although they are different books, but they're the same author, and it uses some of the same Greek terminology, which is translated the same in the English. So it leads us to a natural conclusion that since it's the same author, and since we have similar situations facing the different respective audiences, one at Corinth and one at Rome, then we can draw an inference, or maybe a plausible inference that maybe they're the same situation facing two people, and that the weak and the strong are actually the same parties that Paul has in his mind when he uses, when he penned the letters respectively. Let me a second. Let me look at my time limit, see how much time I've got to go on this particular part. I say, redacted by me to remove the lengthy scriptural quotes for space. Tom Martinsik, I believe, Martinsik of Elia.com opines, and I'm going to stop with a cliffhanger. We'll stop right there for this week, and what we'll do is we'll pick up Elia.com's opinion next week. We'll start reading right there. But we took a small bite out of the commentary tonight, and I hope that was enough to at least whet our appetite. So we're going to start looking now, just kind of give you a sneak peek of next week. What we're going to start looking at is the possibility of the identity of the weak and the strong of Romans 14 and 15:1 through 3, with being the same weak and the strong parties that are people who are described with weak and strong qualities in the Corinthian passages, and see if maybe that'll help drive our understanding of who they are in Romans chapter 14, okay?